What's the most disturbing scene in a fictional book or movie? Haven't seen it mentioned yet, but opening scene to Ghost Ship. Everyone is dancing on the deck in the moonlight when a cord rips, flings around, and slices everyone in half. Since it happens so fast, everyone is still alive for a few moments, sees the terror around them, then their tops slide off the legs. Big bloody mess. Great movie though.
That opening scene is pretty memorable. It's such a shocking start to a film. The contrast between the upbeat vibe of everyone dancing and that sudden chaos really sets a dark tone. It definitely grabs your attention right from the get-go. You don't often see something like that in horror films, and it sticks with you for a while. Overall, it's a wild way to kick off the story.
King's The Mist. A mist covers everything and monstrous things lurk in it. Basically, anyone who enters the mist dies a gruesome death. So, at the end, father, mother, and son are sitting in a car, surrounded by mist. Father knows they will die horribly, so he shoots his son, then his wife. He puts the gun to his head, but it jams or it was out of bullets, I don't remember exactly, and the mist clears to reveal the army. The mist had been defeated right as he killed his family, then he has to live with it.
That story is pretty grim. It reminds me of a time when a friend and I were hiking. We got caught in a thick fog and couldn't see 10 feet ahead. We joked about monsters lurking, but it was mostly just trees. Later, we found out a bear had been in the area. We laughed about it but also realized how quickly things can turn dark, just like in that story.
When Piggy dies in Lord of the Flies, they treated him like such shit. They took advantage of him and never listened even though he was the most level-headed. We never even learned his full name. Then, who was it? Roger? Who fucking tumbles a boulder over the cliff and just splits his head open for no good reason. It just really struck me as the darkest part of the book. If there was anyone who didn't deserve to be killed, especially in such a fucked up way, it was Piggy. R.I.P. Piggy, I hate it had to be you.
Piggy's death in Lord of the Flies always gets to me. He was the smart one, but everyone dismissed him. It feels like such a waste, especially considering how cruel his end was. No one listened to him, and yet he was one of the few trying to hold things together. That moment really highlights how brutal the story can get. It's a reminder that the good ones often don't get what they deserve.
Series finale of MASH. Spoilers: the hero, Hawkeye, is visible mentally unstable, and it's unclear why. He talks to a psychologist and said it's because of the following events. Hawkeye was stuck on a bus that was full of passengers, and they were trying to stay quiet because they were being tracked by the enemy. A chicken kept clucking. In fear, Hawkeye said, "Can't you shut that thing up?" The owner of the chicken then smothered the chicken, killing it but keeping the bus hidden. Later, it is revealed that the chicken was in fact a baby boy.
That's a heavy moment in MASH. Hawkeye's breakdown shows how war messes with people. The twist about the chicken being a baby boy hits hard. It delves into the dark choices people make to survive. The whole scene captures the absurdity and tragedy of war in a way that sticks with you. It's a reminder that the line between life and death can blur in those situations.
Ooh, there's a few, but personally I was shocked by a certain scene in The Pianist concerning treatment within the Warsaw Ghetto. There were so many sad scenes in that film, but that scene where the Nazi officers come into a Jewish family's flat and order the family to stand to attention. A man in a wheelchair cannot stand at all, so the officers simply pick up his wheelchair and tip him off the balcony and drive the family down the street, shooting them as they run. It was a horrific event, really showcasing the cold brutality of the Nazis. And the worst bit is that things like that were probably common. I'm probably forgetting some, but that scene will always stick in my head. Ninja Edit. Noticed Fictional after I typed it, and this technically doesn't count because it's based on a true story. It's still horrific though, so I'll leave it for you all.
That scene in The Pianist really hits hard. The way it shows the brutality of that time is unsettling. It's one of those things that you can't shake off easily. The helplessness of the family and the cold actions of the officers really drive home the horrors people faced. It's chilling to think how these events were probably more common than we can imagine. Definitely a tough moment to witness.
I'm surprised that no one mentioned the stabbing scene from Zodiac. When the killer ties up the couple in broad daylight next to each other on the ground and then begins to stab them to death. For some reason, the scene just sticks with me unlike any others and instills such a strong emotional response.
That scene is definitely intense. It has a way of getting under your skin. The brutality of it really shows the darker side of human nature. It's not just a horror moment, it makes you think about vulnerability. I remember watching it and feeling that chill run through me. It's a reminder of how real fear can be, even in something fictional. Just sticks with you for a while.
I am really impressed with Hannibal the TV show. I liked Hopkins as Hannibal in Silence of the Lambs, and was skeptical of anyone else's depictions. But shit, I think Mads Mikkelsen tops that. He pulls off the cold psychopath depiction, but he has crazy charm beyond Hopkins. Hannibal does bad things, and you still find yourself rooting for him. I mean, it's not like Breaking Bad where there is this progression and justification. Hannibal is evil and does evil / terrible / unjustifiable things, yet he just draws you in with his magnetic personality. And I want to mention how nicely that show is shot. Scene setups, transitions, colors, etc. It is amazing without being all, hey, look at US do art, and this is artistic and technical. It all flows nicely and fits within its style. Such a great job, and the most surprising part is that it's coming from NBC. They really stepped it up, and I think they deserve a lot of kudos for it. I mean, it's a product of the creators who happen to work for NBC, but NBC could easily try and micromanage it and ruin the vision / direction, and they haven't.
I get where you're coming from. Mads really brings a unique intensity to the role. It's interesting how you can be drawn to a character who's clearly evil but still oddly charming. The visuals in the show are also a big win. It manages to create a specific mood without overdoing it. It's surprising to see NBC support such a bold project. They've really done a good job letting the creators run with their vision.
Whoever used to live in my apartment still had her Netflix going here, and she got this movie. My power went out for 30 days after a hurricane here in Richmond, Virginia, 4 years ago, Irene, and I watched in a hot puddle of sweat and tears. Oddly enough, the second movie she ordered was a 1-hour movie of kittens playing with no commentary, just music. LOL.
That sounds intense. Being stuck without power for a month must have been rough. Watching that movie in the heat and silence probably added a strange level of nostalgia or something. And then the kitten movie right after just seems like a big contrast. It's funny how little things like that can stick with you, even in tough times. Sometimes you need a break from everything, even if it's just some kittens.
I watched HC2 with a few of my friends, all of us thinking it was going to be another mock horror, like the first one was. We couldn't have been more wrong. After watching, we all had a sick feeling, and for the first time I really felt like I could have thrown up just from watching something. It was insanely gruesome.
I get that. Sometimes you think a movie will be lighthearted, but it turns out to be really intense. It can stick with you, especially if you're expecting something else. I've had similar experiences, like watching a film with friends thinking we'd have a laugh, but it just ended up being heavy. Those moments can leave you feeling uneasy for a while. It's all part of the movie experience, I guess.
Dude, I love the Berserk films, and I was so excited to watch the third and final. I was so ready for Guts to free Griffith, and for the Band of the Hawk to get back together and fuck shit up. Instead, the eclipse happened. From the moment Griffith sacrificed the band to basically the end of the film, I felt sick to my stomach. Sick because of how gory it was. Sick because Griffith had actually betrayed Guts and the band like that. Sick because of what happened to Casca at the end. How tragic it must have been for Guts. No movie has ever left me feeling like that. And a fucking animated movie was the one that did it. I'm planning on going this week to pick up the first volume of Berserk because, frankly, I need to know more.
I get that. I remember watching a film that twists your expectations. Just when you think it's going to be a happy ending, it hits you with something gut-wrenching. Those moments stay with you, and it's hard to shake off that feeling. It's interesting how stories can have that kind of impact. Picking up the first volume should be good. It's always nice to dive deeper into a story that got under your skin.
I will never forget The Eclipse. Never has a comic actually chilled me the way Berserk did. Seeing all of these characters you've grown to love be ripped apart in the most heinous ways was just heart-wrenching. Berserk is honestly one of the best comics out there, as well as one of the most disturbing.
I remember when I first picked up Berserk. It was a mix of excitement and dread, knowing the kind of darkness it dives into. The characters felt real, and seeing them face such brutal fates really hits differently. It's one of those series that stays with you, making you rethink what you thought you knew about storytelling. It's raw and just memorable in a way that's hard to describe.
Yes, the cannibalistic Tenascauri, SP, army, purposefully starved so that they would know defeat meant death, because their only food source was the people they defeated. The interaction with their leader showed what a badass Sokovian was, though. And Talk the Younger's arc in that book was soul-crushing.
This story reminds me of a book I read where the characters faced tough choices in a brutal world. Itkovian's strength stood out, like a leader who carries the weight for his people. And Talk's journey really hit hard. Seeing his struggles makes you think about sacrifice and resilience. It's a tough read, but it sticks with you. Makes you appreciate the lighter moments in life.
All the End was terrifying. When it came out, I was living in Boulder. There was some art house theater in Denver playing It's So Me. One of my roommates and a friend of his went down to see it. The place had stadium-type seating, and the house was packed. As the movie progressed, I could faintly hear guys apologizing to their dates, and I could vaguely see people getting up to leave. By the end of the movie, the only people left in this packed theater were the three of us, and like 10 other people. This theater held at least 300 people, and as I said, it was packed at the beginning of the film. I've never been able to watch it since.
That sounds pretty intense. I remember going to a late-night horror flick with a couple of friends. The theater was full at first, but as it got to the scary parts, people started leaving. By the end, just a handful of us remained. The vibe was strange, quiet and tense. I couldn't shake the feeling after that, and I haven't watched that movie again either. Some experiences stick with you.
I love how that movie takes you into madness. The movie loses coherency and solidity as the characters do. Starts out feeling clear and slowly turns into a foggy fever dream kind of feel. The Aronofsky and Mansell combo always knows how to make me feel powerful things. Ranting a bit now, Mansell's music is perfect for those movies. Makes me think of The Fountain. That melodic hook in the songs is the perfect kind of bittersweet. And Jackman and Weiss just own that shit. I'd watch it again now if I could stand feeling torn/hollow/empty for a week. Amazing work from everyone involved.
I get that. Some movies just hit you in a way that stays with you for days. The way they dig into your mind, you almost feel their descent. Mansell's music does have that haunting quality, makes everything feel deeper. It's crazy how a soundtrack can make or break a film. You almost want to rewatch but know it'll mess you up for a while. It's tough but also kind of fascinating.
It's worse than just this though. Throughout the film, he does everything right. He makes all the noble calls and behaves completely rationally. He mostly puts others before himself and does his best to keep everyone protected and calm. Meanwhile, there is a completely irrational woman who, after being a bit of a dick, decides to run out into this mist to get her kids. Well, right after he kills his kid and gets out of the car to be eaten by these creatures, who should he see riding merrily by with her children on a tank? Yep, Mrs. Irrational. The film really drills home the point. Life isn't fair. Edit. My memory.
I had a friend who always tried to do the right thing. He was calm and collected, while others around him panicked. One day, during a hike, he helped someone who was lost, staying cool under pressure. Meanwhile, another group ran off, ignoring the danger. Later, we found out they had gotten lost because of their reckless decision. Just like in that film, it made me realize how unfair life can be.
Seriously, I just can't accept that this series doesn't get much attention because for me, it's a genuine work of art. So beautifully produced, written, and acted that, in my opinion, rivals with the like of Breaking Bad in terms of addiction and binge watching. It is a great criminal/drama type show that makes Hopkins tremble in fear due to Mads Mikkelsen acting. Takes a whole new perspective to the character. Makes him a refined perfectionist that I just love to analyze as I am watching. Recommend it to anyone that likes a little bit of mind-fucking and twists and turns that you weren't expecting, combined with phenomenal acting and producing. 9 out of 10 for me.
I get where you're coming from. Sometimes great shows fly under the radar. Mads Mikkelsen really does bring a unique vibe to that role. It's interesting how a character can shift from what you expect to something deeper. I enjoy those unexpected twists too. They keep you engaged. It's nice to find something that hooks you in and makes you think. Sounds like it's worth a watch for sure.
I firmly agree with all your points. For the longest time, I didn't even realize the show was NBC content. Watched it on Netflix. Mads Mikkelsen's acting, the entire cast is dope, TBH, and the writing plus direction are all works of art. Also, for the longest time I was fascinated with depictions of psychopaths on screen, and this show gets it right. The fact that Hannibal is a psychiatrist who discusses these characteristics with someone on the spectrum in such precise, clinical terms is an added bonus for me.
I get what you mean. I also didn't know some shows were from specific networks until later. The acting and writing in those kinds of shows really do stand out. Mads Mikkelsen's performance is something else. The way they explore complex characters like that is interesting. It definitely adds depth when the show dives into the psychology. You can learn a lot just by watching how they interact.
When Mikkelsen was cast as Hannibal, he told Brian Fuller he didn't want to simply do an Anthony Hopkins impression. He was unsure how to go about portraying the character, so that it was, like you say, evil, yet magnetic. Mikkelsen came up with an idea to play Hannibal as though he is Lucifer in the flesh, and Fuller loved it. So, without ever actually alluding to it head-on, the whole show is presented from the stance that Hannibal doesn't do evil things just to do them, but to influence everyone around him just to see what will happen. It gave an extra layer to the show that makes it, in my opinion, better than the original material, which I honestly didn't think was possible.
I get the struggle of trying to capture a character without copying someone else's take. It's interesting how Mikkelsen wanted to make Hannibal more complex, almost philosophical in a way. Playing him like Lucifer adds a twist that deepens the narrative. It's always cool when an actor's creative choices elevate a show, making it way more engaging than what we usually expect. That kind of fresh perspective can really change the game.
Berserk, action sequences aside, has one of the most depth-driven plots I've ever experienced. The sheer hatred that Griffith and Berserk Guts exhibit for each other is impossible to fathom, unless you consider their thought processes that culminated in the eclipse. I still remember having discussing Griffith's break for a solid day with my ex.
That sounds intense. It's wild how deep those characters go and the choices they make. I can see how a conversation about that could last hours, especially with someone who shares the same interest. It really sticks with you when a story hits so hard, right? Those kinds of discussions often reveal a lot about ourselves too. Just shows how powerful narratives can be in connecting people.
Spoilers, it's explained later that the compromise was never meant to be actually implemented. It was originally a last-ditch attempt by the government to shock each side into starting peace talks after they had basically been waging an extremely bloody civil war for several years. At the time, it was suggested it wasn't even medically possible, but shortly after the proposal was made, a researcher came forward with a way to make the procedure relatively easy to perform. The timing of this is also explained later. By that time, each side was so entrenched that they would rather take the fake deal than concede anything to the other side, and everyone else was so tired of the fighting that they just went along with it.
It's interesting how sometimes people get so caught up in their positions that they'd rather stick to a bad deal than actually find common ground. This reminds me of a friend who used to argue about the dumbest things. Instead of just talking it out, they dig their heels in, making everything worse. In the end, it took a major event for them to realize it was better to compromise than to keep fighting a pointless battle.
The idea is that the person doesn't really die, or at least that's how the process is marketed. They just go and live in a bunch of different bodies. For example, in one part of the book, a kid who had a part of his brain replaced by a previous kleptomaniac's unconsciously went home and dug up Slash, gave all the stuff back.
That concept is interesting. I mean, the whole idea of living through different bodies sounds wild. It's like a mix of science fiction and philosophy. Imagine getting traits or memories from others. It could lead to some funny or awkward situations, like the kid returning stolen stuff without knowing why. It makes you think about identity and what really makes us who we are.
The camera was set on the floor and doesn't move the whole scene. The goal of the director was to disgust the audience with extreme violence. Then after they get bored because nothing new is happening on the screen, they become disgusted with themselves for feeling bored when something so horrible is happening. The film is one of the best examples of a director manipulating the audience. When the film opens and the credits roll, the film is in reverse. Most people watching immediately begin to turn their heads to read the text as it rotates counterclockwise, which signifies time going backwards.
That's an interesting concept. The idea of manipulating the audience's emotions through a fixed perspective is pretty unique. It challenges the viewer to confront their feelings about violence and boredom. I can't imagine how uncomfortable it must be to sit through that. It's a bold choice for a director, focusing on the psychological aspect rather than just shock value. It definitely makes you think about your reactions to different content.
Breaking Bad spoilers, I just remembered what he's talking about. It's after the train robbery and the kid shows up on his motorbike. Then Meth Damon takes it upon himself to shoot him. The opening scene of the next episode was Walt, Mike, Jesse, and Todd are disassembling the motorbike and putting it in the acid along with the kid.
That part is pretty intense. The whole situation just shows how far they've gone to cover their tracks. It's a real turning point in the show, where you see the shift in their moral compass. Todd's character really takes a dark turn there. It's crazy to think how they started out and where they ended up. Definitely makes you rethink what you're watching sometimes.
The movie takes place in a post-apocalyptic version of the U.S. A man and his young son are attempting to get south on foot before the winter comes. The world has descended into chaos with roving bands of cannibals a common sight. The man and his son find a house that seems undisturbed, which is a rarity. They go down into the underground cellar of the house to look for food. When they turn on the light, a bunch of naked, legless people attack them. They have been locked in the cellar and used as a source of food by whatever band of cannibals has been living there.
That sounds pretty intense. I remember a time when a friend and I were hiking in a remote area. We found this abandoned cabin. It was eerie, kind of like a horror movie setup. We opened the door, and it felt like we were in a time capsule. Just old furniture and dust everywhere. For some reason, we got really creeped out and left quickly. It just shows how the unknown can mess with your head.
Actually, that'd predate Old Night and the birth of Slaanesh by several thousand years. Event Horizon is accepted informally as the first documented case of a ship translating into and out of the warp. Because it lacked a Geller field to protect it, the crew was driven mad by what they saw and experienced. This would have preceded the dark age of technology by thousands of years. Odds are, the gods of chaos manipulated Sam Neill's character into building it.
Pretty wild how early space travel had such dark consequences. Imagine being part of the crew on that ship, facing madness instead of discovering new worlds. The idea of chaos gods pulling strings behind the scenes adds a creepy twist. It's a reminder of how fragile our understanding of the universe can be, especially when dabbling with things beyond what we can control. Definitely makes you think about the risks in exploration.
Considering King's track record on endings, I'm pretty sure he's jealous of every ending out there. Don't get me wrong, I like a fair amount of his work, but writing a satisfying conclusion to his stories is not one of his strengths. Looking at you, The Stand, edit. Just a heads up everyone, please don't spoil 11/22/63 for me. I'm currently reading it because I'm behind the times.
Yeah, I get that. Some of Stephen King's endings leave you wanting more. I remember reading The Stand and feeling like it just fizzled out. It's funny how a great setup can be let down by the conclusion. Good that you're diving into November 22nd, 63 though. It's interesting seeing how time travel can change things. Hope it turns out better for you than some of his other works.
Something that I only appreciated after reading it a few times was that there's more than 100 pages of mindless tedium before he actually kills someone. You get to a point where you're like, Christ, kill someone already. And then he does. And it's horrific, and you're confronted with the fact that you wanted it to happen in the first place. The rest of the book really makes you regret wanting to be a voyeur of all of Bateman's murders and sexual escapades, while still wanting something to happen that will break up the tedium of Armani suits, Blaupunks, and Phil Collins reviews.
It's interesting how that build-up in stories can change your perspective. You find yourself waiting for the action, almost craving it. But when it happens, it hits hard. It's like you wish for something thrilling, then get hit with the weight of the consequences. Makes you think about what we really desire in stories and the darker sides of human curiosity, you know? It's a complex relationship with the narrative.
People griped that the end of the Dark Tower series wasn't all that great. But in all fairness, how exactly do you resolve a story of that scope and magnitude? And I'm not talking the size of the series, but the actual plot. It's a story that spans dimension, time, and pretty much the universe itself. How do you just wrap that up?
Yeah, endings are tough, especially with something as complex as the Dark Tower. A lot of people want a perfect tie-up, but it's hard to satisfy everyone. It's like trying to explain a massive dream you had. Even if it feels off to some, it still wraps up a big journey. Sometimes it's less about how it ends and more about everything that led up to it.
Zan, I will agree that the gunslinger might turn off some people. I almost didn't enjoy it, but I pressed on and you start to get a little more context. The gunslinger pretty much starts in media res, and you have to sort of patch things together in a rather bizarre world. But it gets even crazier. I won't spoil it, but I won't lie when I say that the plot and setting transcends dimensions. What I will say is if you read a lot of King's other works, especially The Stand, you'll quickly gain a much bigger appreciation of all of it.
Yeah, I get that. Sometimes stories just throw you in without much explanation. I remember starting a book like that. Had me confused at first. But as I kept reading, things started clicking. It's like the author respects the reader enough to figure things out. King's universe is pretty wild, though. If you know his other works, it definitely makes for a richer experience. Takes patience, but it's usually worth it.
The Gunslinger pretty much starts in media res, and you have to sort of patch things together in a rather bizarre world. This is actually why I love The Gunslinger. I almost would have rather just had the one book than the whole 7. I felt the others were good, but the first really felt different.
I get what you mean. The first book definitely has this raw, mysterious vibe that stands out. It's like you dive straight into this strange world without all the buildup. I remember my friend had a similar take. They said the first felt more unique, almost like a standalone piece. The rest had their moments, but the initial impact is hard to replicate. It's like capturing lightning in a bottle.
Excellent summary, but you forgot one important piece of lore: the Iron Man. Super advanced AI built by humanity to effectively do everything for us that eventually turned on their masters and forced the Golden Age humanity to fight one of the most destructive wars in galactic history, which very nearly destroyed human civilization, which made it all the worse when the Eye of Terror opened and cut off the barely surviving patches of human settlement from each other, which prompted the Emperor to reveal himself and create the Imperium.
Sounds like a classic tale of creation gone wrong. You build something to make life easier, and it ends up causing chaos. Reminds me of a friend who got a smart home system and it started malfunctioning. He locked himself out of his own house once. Kind of funny, but also a little scary. Just shows technology can backfire, even in a more everyday scenario.
Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.